The definition of a turning point battle is that before that battle, there was a tendency in the war that is reversed after the turning point battle. Before the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans were the ones who chose where and when the battles were going to take place in the ETO, the European Theater of Operations. However, after losing at Stalingrad, it's going to be the Russians as much or more than the Germans. Before Stalingrad, Hitler really never lost any battles on the Eastern Front. After Stalingrad, he really never won any. So that's the turning point in the European war. In the east, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the German forces are going to be pushed back to 1943, where we will continue at Kursk. Now we shift over to the Pacific Ocean. And in the Pacific, the Japanese are trying to conquer the Australian city of Port Moresby on the island of New Guinea. If they can conquer Port Moresby, they can have a base of operations for going into Australia, which is their ultimate goal. And if the Japanese land massive armies in Australia, it's not going to be good for the Aussies. So, Japan sends two of its fleet carriers and a few minor carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, or the fleet carriers, south, and they're going to go around New Guinea into the Coral Sea, land troops at Port Moresby as a preparation for an attack into Australia. The Americans have code breakers in Hawaii. The Americans and the British throughout both world wars have a real advantage in math skills and in the kind of creative, playful math that involves cryptography. Cryptography is the making of and breaking of codes. Our code breakers have managed to decipher a good part of the Japanese Navy code. But that code is changed just before this new operation. They begin working on it, and they think the attack is going to happen down here. So we send the aircraft carrier Yorktown and Lexington south to stop or at least attack the Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, you have the first naval engagement where the ships on both sides never come into eyesight of one another. Instead, what's happening is it's a battle of air fleets, of aircraft carriers. The Japanese are searching for the Americans are searching for the Japanese, and instead of firing a lot of bullets at close range at one another, they are launching aircraft who will then attack with torpedoes and bombs each other's ships. At the Battle of Coral Sea, the American carrier Lexington is sunk. It's a heavy carrier. The Japanese lose a light carrier, and the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku are damaged. Tactically, it's a draw. Actually, the Japanese, by sinking an American heavy carrier, may very well have had an advantage. But strategically, it's an Allied victory because the Japanese invasion fleet, losing its carrier support, turn around and steam away back to Rabaul from Port Moresby. The Japanese are going to have to try to take Port Moresby by crossing the Owen Stanley Mountains in Papua New Guinea, and the Australians are going to refortify that, and American troops are going to join them, and it's going to be a horrible jungle mountain fight on the island of New Guinea. But the Japanese are never going to get Port Moresby. Battle of Coral Sea is a precursor to something else that our code breakers think is happening. What they think is that the Japanese are going to try to draw forces south with the attack on Port Moresby. They're then going to draw forces north to the Aleutian Islands with an attack on Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians, those little string of islands shooting out of Alaska westward, and with an attack on Dutch Harbor, which is the capital of the Aleutians area of Alaska. Their theory is that the American fleet, led by our carriers, will go north, and at that point, the Japanese main fleet will take the island of Midway. If the Japanese can take Midway, they're going to have an air base within air strike range of Pearl Harbor. The American fleet will have to leave Pearl Harbor and go back to San Diego or to San Francisco as its prime base. The Americans will be knocked back thousands of miles, and the Japanese might be able to conquer the Hawaiian Islands. This is called Operation... Oh, I forget. In any event, our code breakers are breaking maybe one word in 10. And they gather all of this. But the high command in the United States is not convinced that they know what they're talking about. So a code trap, is arrived at. They send a courier to Midway to transmit a message that Midway's saltwater freshwater converter is damaged and needs to be replaced, needs a replacement part. Now, the code breakers think that objective AF is Midway Island. And soon, our code breakers hear Japanese traffic saying that AF is having trouble with its saltwater converter. Confirmation. We now know that objective AF is Midway. And that gives Admiral Nimitz, the American Pacific Fleet commander, confidence to launch his plan. His plan is not to go north to defend the Aleutian Islands off Alaska. Instead, he is going to move the carriers USS Enterprise and Hornet to the area around Midway. The local commander, American Admiral Spruance, is going to be in position here to bushwhack the Japanese if they come into Midway, and to be in a position to protect Hawaii if necessary. The Japanese fleet, minus Shokaku and Zuikaku, consists of 4 heavy fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. These come in behind a harsh weather front. But the Japanese disperse their fleet. Their aircraft carriers are coming in from the northwest. Their battle fleet, their surface warships, are coming from west, and their troops are coming in from the southwest. They believe that by dispersing their fleet this way, it's going to be less vulnerable to air attack. Well, there's good and there's bad in that theory, and you'll see how. The Japanese launch attacks on Midway on June 3rd, 1942. Or June 2nd, 1942. The Midway airfield is damaged. The American Buffalo fighters are sank. All of them are shot down. But then the Japanese are hit by American torpedo bombers. The torpedo bombers are not from the island of Midway. And suddenly, Japanese Admiral Nagumo realizes that there must be American aircraft carriers nearby. Now, he's launched an attack on Midway. It damaged the runway, but it didn't destroy the runway. So his planes have come back from that attack just around the time that the torpedo bombers came in. So he's got a choice to make. Does he continue arming the planes that have returned to his carriers with land attack bombs, small bombs, designed to crater the runway at Midway? Or does he arm his planes with anti-ship weapons, anti-ship bombs, and torpedoes? Well, they had been loading up with bombs for the land attack. But Nagumo says, no, we're going to switch around, and we are going to prepare to attack the American carriers. We're going to send out scouts. We're going to find them. And so those ships are filled, are covered. Their decks are covered with aircraft, with ammunition, with fuel, because their bullets are being changed, their torpedoes are being, and bombs are being changed. Everything is a mess on these ships. Now, the American carriers have launched attacks, guessing where the Japanese are, but not knowing for sure. An American squadron from the USS Enterprise, a dive bomber squadron, has a lucky break. Just as they're approaching what's called bingo fuel, which is they have to return to base because they've used up half their fuel. They have to return to their carriers. Just as they're approaching that point, the American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise spots a Japanese torpedo hauling backside northeastward, flank speed. Well, what had happened was an American submarine had gotten close to the Japanese carriers, and the Japanese had dispatched a destroyer to attack it. This destroyer was finished attacking the submarine; they didn't sink it, and they were heading back to the carriers. The American commander of the torpedo squadron says, "We're not going home. We're gonna go along the line of that destroyer. The destroyer's going this way. We are gonna go that way, and we're gonna find the Japanese fleet." It was an inspired choice. When the dive bombers from the Enterprise arrive over the Japanese fleet, the Japanese fleet is covered with aircraft being rearmed. And the fighters that were tasked to protect the Japanese fleet from American air attack had gone down low to sink a wave of American dive bombers. Dive bombers come in right over the surface of the ocean, and the fighters had gone down, and they'd shot them all down. There was only one survivor, Ensign George Gay. The rest of that squadron, that torpedo squadron, was completely destroyed. But the Japanese fighters were down low. The dive bombers were up high. The Japanese aircraft carriers were in the process of rearming their planes, and so all the explosives and fuel were right there. There are times when I look at history and I see the hand of God at work or something. It's just an amazing coincidence that all these things happened. So the dive bombers from the Enterprise were then later joined by other dive bombers in a 2 to 3 minute period. Bomb and destroy 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. Sunk. Only the Hiryu survives. All in one glorious, amazing, unfathomably lucky and fortunate dive bombing attack. The Japanese lose 3 of their 4 carriers present. In a subsequent series of attacks, the USS Yorktown, which had survived the battle at the Coral Sea, was damaged and ultimately sunk. But the last Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was also sunk. This is the turning point in the Pacific War. Before this point, the Japanese had barely lost a battle. After this point, the Japanese were going to have difficulty winning anything. And it all comes down to pilots. The Japanese pilots on aircraft carriers were considered to be samurai, knights. They were chosen in adolescence, and they were raised to be pilots, and it took a decade or more to produce a Japanese fighter pilot, and they were incredibly good. But now they're incredibly dead. The only carrier pilots that are left are on Shokaku and Zuikaku. Everyone else is dead. American pilots are considered to be professionals. They train, they do a job, and they cycle in and out. 1/3 of America's carrier pilots are at sea with the fleet. 1/3 are resting, and 1/3 are training. And when they're training, they're training other pilots. So the knowledge of how to be a good aircraft carrier pilot is expanded by the American system of education, which trains many, many, many pilots. We do not have a shortage of pilots because of this system of training. But the Japanese, because they look at their pilots like samurai, like knights, when their pilots are anywhere but with the fleet, they're complaining. The pilots want to be at the point of the spear with the fleet. And when the fleet gets sunk, like it does at Midway, it's going to be an irreplaceable loss for the Japanese Navy. And we will see that the existence of Shokaku and Zuikaku's air groups is going to give the Japanese some oomph in the next turning point battle, which is the Battle of Guadalcanal. But the Battle of Midway is the last time when Japan could have won the naval war in the Pacific against the United States. The last turning point battle is the American version of Stalingrad. It's on a much smaller scale, but it happens at about exactly the same time, and it involves many of the same things, even though it's on a tropical island and not a Russian city. Battle of Guadalcanal next.